Colm is the author of several award-winning novels, including Blackwater Lightship, The South, The Master, and of course Brooklyn, which was made into a film, Oscar-nominated film, a couple of years ago. And I am a tremendous fan of his work because I feel like he instills every event, every moment, every line of dialogue in his work is just so special, and it makes events of routines, by which I mean he makes drama out of everyday life. And yet the drama in his latest novel, House of Names, is anything but everyday. It's a retelling of an aspect of the Oresteia. Concerns Clytemnestra, Agamemnon, Iphigenia, Electra, Orestes, all your favorites. And Mr. Tóibín's skills with characterization brings the Greeks and their world to life. These characters pumps through these pages. I mean it. House of Names is about how honor, loyalty, religion, and duty govern the world, but love, anger, remorse, and revenge are always wrestling for control of men's fates. It's hard to tell which is the right path when each one has numerous gods dedicated to it. And while this may be Colm Tóibín's most outwardly passionate tale, it feels like a natural progression for him as a storyteller. All of his characters often feel trapped and decide to will themselves forward with definitive consequences for everyone they touch. Will you all please join me in welcoming Colm Tóibín?
Thank you for coming. As I said, I'm not responsible for this story. I didn't make it up. There's a late play by Euripides called Iphigenia in Aulis that I hadn't read. And in one of the introductions by Anne Carson, I came across a reference to it and thought, I should read that. And when I read it, I realized that I wondered if in old age, poor old Euripides thought he had done really bad, that she'd been dealt a bad set of cards, poor old Clytemnestra, that Electra got all the best lines, that when Electra appears, her mother just interrupts her, and Electra just shuts her mother down. But actually, Clytemnestra has a pretty good case, that her husband, Agamemnon, asked the gods what to do, because he wanted the winds to change. And the gods said, the winds will change, but you must sacrifice your daughter Iphigenia. So he realized the best way of doing this was to lure his wife, Clytemnestra, and his daughter, and their young son, Orestes, to the camp and say there's going to be a wedding. Bring your clothes, it's going to be a wedding. And when she arrives, Clytemnestra, he doesn't have the courage to tell her. So when they meet first, he picks up the boy, plays sword fighting, he hugs his daughter. It's a picture of reunion, of happiness. It's only later she finds out when she meets Achilles and says to him, you're going to marry my daughter. He says, do you really not know why you're here? And she doesn't. And she finds out. And she does everything to stop him. And then she can't. And what she decides to do then is to murder him when he returns. And when he returns with Cassandra in tow, she's ready for him. She has a lover called Aegisthus, and they're absolutely prepared. They have planned every single moment down to the smallest detail. And in order to do this, she's had to make a move which is really cataclysmic, which is that everyone else has implored the gods for permission to do what they do. But she has decided that she won't, that she will do what she will do on her own, that her will be what decides, that she will personally decide. And also she watches her husband, Agamemnon, where he knows, I think it's something this is not a contemporary novel, but nonetheless these stories never leave us. I think we're living in a time when it's very, very clear to certain people not far from here what they should do. And it's also very, very clear to certain people here what they will do. And there will be a gap always between, but in all of us, for all of us, in all our lives, often a gap between what we should do and what we actually do. But she watches Clytemnestra watches Agamemnon, where he realizes that this is wrong, that sacrificing his daughter is wrong, but the troops want him to do it. and he's caught between the two, and she has contempt for his weakness as he realizes that he will go with the flow. He will go with the easy decision. He won't make the difficult one. So the first bit I want to read really is her. One of the problems with intimate violence, one of the problems with civil war, one of the problems with gang war is that the spiral. Once the spiral begins, it continues. It's very difficult to stop. One killing leads to a second, leads to an atrocity, leads to something unbelievable. And so she is, once she does this killing, finds herself in a state of total excitement. I have been acquainted with the smell of death, the sickly, sugary smell that wafted in the wind towards the rooms in this palace. It is easy now for me to feel peaceful and content. I spend my morning looking at the sky and the changing light. The bird song begins to rise as the world fills with its own pleasures, and then as day wanes, the sound too wanes and fades. I watch as the shadows lengthen. So much has slipped away, but the smell of death lingers. Maybe the smell has entered my body and been welcomed there, like an old friend come to visit, the smell of fear and panic. The smell is here like the very air is here. It returns in the same way as light in the morning returns. It is my constant companion. It has put life into my eyes, eyes that grew dull with waiting, but are not dull now, eyes that are alive now with brightness. I gave orders that their bodies should remain in the open under the sun a day or two until the sweetness gave way to stench. And I liked the flies that came, their little bodies perplexed and brave, buzzing after their feast, upset by the continuing hunger they felt in themselves, a hunger I had come to know too and had come to appreciate. We are all hungry now. Food merely whets our appetite, it sharpens our teeth. Meat makes us ravenous for more meat, as death is ravenous for more death. Murder makes us ravenous, fills the soul with satisfaction that is fierce and then luscious enough to create a taste for further satisfaction. A knife piercing the soft flesh under the ear with intimacy and precision, and then moving across the throat as soundlessly as the sun moves across the sky, but with greater speed and zeal, and then his dark blood flowing with the same inevitable hush as dark night falls on familiar things. I had spies to tell me when my husband would come back. Men lit each fire that gave the news to further hills where other men lit fires to alert me. It was the fires that brought the news, not the gods. Among the gods now there is no one who offers me assistance or oversees my actions or knows my mind. There is no one among the gods to whom I appeal. I live alone in the shivering, solitary knowledge that the time of the gods has passed. I'm praying to no gods. I'm alone among those here because I do not pray and will not pray again. Instead, I will speak in ordinary whispers. I will speak in words that come from the world, and those words will be filled with regret for what has been lost. I will make sounds like prayers, but prayers that have no source and no destination, not even a human one, since my daughter is dead and cannot hear. I know, as no one else knows, that the gods are distant. They have other concerns. They care about human desires and antics in the same way as I care about the leaves of a tree. I know the leaves are there. They wither and grow again and wither as people come and live and then are replaced by others like them. There's nothing I can do to help them or prevent their withering. I do not deal with their desires. I wish now to stand here and laugh. Hear me tittering and then howling with mirth at the idea that the gods allowed my husband to win his war, that they inspired every plan he worked out and every move he made, that they knew his cloudy moods in the morning and the strange and silly exhilaration he could exude at night, that they listened to his implorings and discussed them in their godly homes, that they watched the murder of my daughter with approval. The bargain was simple. Or so his troops believed. Kill the innocent girl in return for a change in the wind. Take her out of the world. Use a knife on her flesh to ensure that she would never walk again into a room or wake in the morning. Deprive the world of her grace. And as a reward, the gods would make the wind blow in her father's favor on the day he needed wind for his sails. they would hush the wind on the other days when his enemies needed it. The gods would make his men alert and brave and fill his enemies with fear. The gods would strengthen his swords and make them swift and sharp. When he was alive, he and the men around him believed that the gods followed their fates and cared about them, each of them. But I will say now that they did not, they do not. Our appeal to the gods is the same as the appeal a star makes in the sky above us before it falls. It is a sound we cannot hear, a sound to which even if we did hear, we would be fully indifferent. The gods have their own unearthly concerns, unimagined by us. They barely know we are alive. For them, if they were to hear of us, we would be like the mild sound of wind in the trees, a distant, unpersistent, rustling sound. I know that it was not always thus. There was a time when the gods came in the morning to wake us, when they combed our hair and filled our mouths with the sweetness of speech, and listened to our desires and tried to fill them for us, when they knew our minds and when they could send us signs. Not long ago within our memories, the crying women could be heard in the night, in the time before death came. It was a way of calling the dying home, hastening their flight, softening their wavering journey to the place of rest. My husband was with me in the days before my mother died, and we both heard it, and my mother heard it too, and it comforted her that death was ready to lure her with its cries. That noise has stopped. There is no more crying like the wind. The dead fade in their own time. No one helps them. No one notices except those who have been close to them during their short spell in the world. As they fade from the earth, the gods do not hover over with their haunting whistling sound. I notice it here, the silence around death. They have departed, the ones who oversaw death. They have gone and will not be back. I went out and looked at the sky, and all I had then to help me was the leftover language of prayer. What had once been powerful and added meaning to everything was now desolate, strange, with its own sad brittle power, with its memory locked in its rhythms of a vivid past when our words rose up and found completion. Now our words are trapped in time. They are filled with limits. They are mere distractions. They are as fleeting and monotonous as breath. They keep us alive, and maybe that is something, at least for the moment, for which we should be grateful. There is nothing else. And as I was writing the book, there were I suppose, a number of things other than the Greek myths, which helped to sort of nourish the book. Certainly, one was the whole what happens in Wagner's Ring, as the power of the gods begin to wane, especially a scene in Siegfried where Wotan goes to find Erda, to whom he was married before, who's buried in the earth, and he wakes her from her sleep in the earth, and she comes. She's got all wisdom, and she's got either a mezzo or a contralto in the Metries, and she's played by Patricia Barden. But there are other. Once I saw it where actually he rings on an apartment. They did a modern production. He rings on a bell, and she gets an elevator, and she arrives. But whatever happens, she tells him that your power is coming to an end. I mean, it takes 45 minutes, but it's very powerful because he doesn't know, and she's the only one who can tell him what's actually going to happen. And then we watch it unfold. I was also using certain Irish myths, especially Cuchulainn and the elements from the Tóibín, and I threw in the children of Lir, just because the mother of Clytemnestra is Leda. And once I had Leda and the swan, I couldn't keep away from the other story of the swans, which is the Children of Lir story, which is one of the great Irish folk tales. And but the other thing that I began to notice that is there is how much Shakespeare took from this, how much he took, for example, from Macbeth, the idea of killing a king, and of it being done, very, very carefully by a man and a woman as a sort of conspiracy in a palace, which is what happens to Agamemnon when he returns by the hands of Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus, so that they can, in a way, take power. I mean, in the Greek, it's have revenge. And there's also elements of Coriolanus, the sort of warrior queen thing, but it was more Hamlet than anything else, the idea that once Orestes returns, And there's a gap in this story, which is, no matter whose text you read Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, where was Orestes when he was away? He returns, famously, this idea of leaving a lock. He has to lock of his hair, has to prove to his sister Electra that it is he. But where was he? And that's a godsend to a novelist. I mean, I want to hear now just publicly thank the Greeks for leaving this out, so that it was absolutely free for me to imagine it. But when he returns, he is in the same position as Hamlet. He's a young man who's come back from somewhere, whose father has been murdered, and whose mother has taken a lover, and who roams uneasily in this space of the palace, wondering who he is or what to do. In this text, which Shakespeare realized that it just was one step too far, the Hamlet doesn't murder Gertrude. I mean, he comes close at a certain point, you know. Hamlet, when he says to her, you know that scene, Hamlet, thou hast thy father much offended, mother, thou hast my father much offended. And so it goes on. But in this story, he kills her. And it was really hard to work. I mean, I had to sort of build. He is not a psychopath. He's just caught between his sister and his mother. He's passive. He isn't good at making decisions. He's easily led. He isn't a leader. He's sort of dreamy, but that dreaminess, because he's under such pressure, will lead him to do anything under those pressures. And they include the fact that he will, as his mother is walking down steps in a garden, that he will actually kill her. The problem I have then is what do you do on the next page? that you know, you have, oh my God, he's killed her. And that, I mean, it's the same reason as the gods really have to be got out of the book early, because the novel really isn't a good place for gods. If you think about it, you know, Jane Austen didn't really, it isn't as though she opens a chapter saying that evening the gods made a decision that Mr. Darcy would ride his horse over towards, you know, that it's all, and even though they're clergymen, they seem never to pray. I mean, they're always just wandering around being foolish. But, you know, and even poor Henry James, I mean, it isn't as though Isabel Archer knelt down at night by the fire and asked God what to do about Osmond. You know, it was the Countess Gemini who came and told her. You know, in other words, that the novel, as it's developed, seems to be filled with human choice, human chance, human destiny, human will. And so that was one of the reasons to get that out. But anyway, since Hamlet has this ghost at the beginning, you know, that Shakespeare does let in the supernatural, I realised that when you turn the page, when Orestes has just killed his mother, what you get is his mother's ghost. And just to remember that she is the daughter of Leda, who was raped by the swan, who, you know, the god Zeus in the form of a swan. So there is just a mention of that. And there is a mention also of her memory of how she was killed. There was a garden and steps to a garden. So anyway, this is Clytemnestra talking from the dead. There will come a time when the shadows fold in on me. I know that. But I'm awake now, or almost awake. I remember some things, outlines come to me, and the faint sound of voices. What linger most are traces of people, presences, sounds. Mostly I walk among the shades, but sometimes a hint of someone comes close. Someone whose name I once knew, or whose voice and face were real to me. Someone I once loved, perhaps, I'm not sure. There's one remnant that comes and persists, however. It is my mother, at some time in the distant past. She is helpless, being held down. I can hear cries, her cries, and the shriller cries of a figure above her, or lying on her, and then louder cries as the figure flits away, a figure with a beak and wings, with the shape of wings, the wings beating in the air, and my mother lying breathless, whimpering. But I do not know what this means or why it comes to me. I feel that if I remain still, something more will come. It is hard not to wander in these spaces when there is silence. There are presences I wish to encounter, presences that are close but not close enough to touch or be seen. I cannot think of their names. And I cannot see faces clearly enough, although there are moments when I have been quiet, when I have made no effort for some time to remember or focus. Moments when a face approaches, the face of someone I have known, but it fades before it becomes anyone I can recognize. I know that there was feeling, and that is the difference between where I am now and the place I was once. There was a time, I know, when I felt rage and I felt sorrow, but now I have lost what leads to rage and sorrow. Maybe the only reason I wander in these spaces has to do with some other feeling or what is left of it. Maybe that feeling is love. There is someone whom I love still, or have loved and protected, but I cannot be sure of that. No name will come. Some words come, but not the words I want, which are the names. If I can say the names, I will know then whom I loved, and I will find them or know how to see them. I will lure them into the shadows when the time is right. No one in their world knows how little there is here. It is all blankness, strangeness, silence. Hardly anything moves. There are echoes like distant water flowing under rock, and then sometimes that sound comes nearer, but it is still faint. If I listen too eagerly, it disappears. Maybe there are things that did not come to an end when I was there, and they linger now like words that need to be said, or words that have escaped me and will come, or might come, or must come as I wait here. It will take time. I do not know how much time I have, or how much time there is. But I know that I must fade, that I cannot persist in this state. The fading will be gradual. By the end I will not know anything. What I'm hoping for is one more surge, some hours or even moments when I will go back into the world and settle into it briefly as though I were alive. In the meantime, there is memory which connects and attaches and withdraws. It is almost something. A vague thought hovers but is never stable. Like a figure with wings, it edges towards what has been or was. I live on the inside of what has substance. I can feel some large set of pressing desires brushing past. All I am left with, though, are the grey traces, the clues. This must be what shadow is like, or aftermath. Some lines or shapes that must have made sense at one time or may still make sense, but seem random now. If only I could follow what their intention was, or whisper to whoever made them. That desire is the closest I have come to pure feeling, and is not close at all. I will be left here for the day, hours and days or years I have been allotted, no longer than that. Being perplexed and bewildered replaces truth and knowledge, replaces what is real and tangible. The space I inhabit is like a sad gift that was offered but will soon be withdrawn. And then a word occurred to me, a word of which I was sure. It was the word dream. Once the word came, I knew what dream was, or had been. I was certain then that I was not dreaming in this nullness, that none of what is happening is dream. It is real, it is actual. And then other words appeared like stars in the darkening sky. I became desperate to take possession of each one, but I could not hold on to them. They were falling or glittering or moving further away. It was enough, however, to have seen them, to get some idea of their power, and know that some of them would return and, like the light from a full moon on a dark night, become part of a shadowy stability that was guiding me. I walked in the corridors of that palace where I had once lived. I could almost remember some things that had happened. There was an image of someone in a garden or on steps that led to a garden, staring hard, breathing hard, but then nothing. Just stillness in the garden. And then there was not even a garden, there was merely a space. But I was still awake, I was waiting, knowing that there would be change, that it would not always be like this. I was aware how easy it would be once I was in those corridors again for one of the guards to notice me if I made a sound or if I moved quickly, so that there would be some disturbance in the air. And then slowly I began to understand why I was here and who I was looking for. His name did not come to me, and I was not able to picture his face, but I felt that he was close. I could imagine the guard who had seen me or who had noticed my presence consulting one of the other guards, and then both of them approaching him, the one I'm searching for, my friend, the one I'm searching for, or his friend who looks after him. My husband is dead, and my daughter. They have become pure shade. My other daughter is here, but the one I am searching for is my son. I'm awake, The words I knew are sleeping. Sometimes they turn in the night or make some sound in their vast dreaming, and then they wake too. Often, if only for a second, they open their eyes and watch me. I hold their gaze so that they might remember me as they fall back into sleep. I study them then in their inert state. I'm alert to any movement they make. I can hear their dark groanings in the night, intermittent against their breathing. I can see them reach their arms towards me to be lifted. I can tell the difference between night and day now. I know the silence that descends on the gardens and corridors at night, a silence broken only by the soft movements of the guards or of cats. This is my realm, where I am free to wander. As I come from the garden, I'm aware that the guards can feel a movement in the air. Just take one more thing to let them know that I'm with them, a sound, a darting gesture. When the time came, I knew that I would hear his name, my son's name, enough to whisper it, like someone imploring. It would come to me when I needed it. Orestes, I whispered on one of those nights, and then I withdrew into the shadows. Orestes, I repeated, letting my voice echo down the corridor. I saw two of the guards running back and forth and then summoning the other one, my son's friend, who strutted up and down, checking doorways and corners. I waited until he had gone, and then I whispered to one of the guards, "Tell Orestes that I am his mother. He must come alone into the corridor. He must be alone." The guard made as though to run, but then stopped himself. "Speak again," he said quietly, his head bowed. "Tell Orestes to come alone," I said. "Now?" he asked. "Soon. Orestes must come soon." "Do you mean to cause him harm?" "No. I do not mean to cause him harm." Thanks very much.
One of my favorite pieces of yours that came out last year was the piece that you wrote for the London Review about the Easter Rebellion in 1916. And I was just curious if revisiting that time in history influenced the writing of this at all, and kind of just what that, because that was really profound for me. You know, it taught me so much about it, and I just didn't know if it influenced this at all and kind of what that meant to you.
Yeah, I mean, part of my problem is that I'm just a girl that can't say no, and so that I was meant to be writing this book, but the centenary of the 1916 rebellion was coming, and I didn't want to be sort of. I had particular problems for the 75th anniversary, because the IRA campaign in Northern Ireland was still going on. And I think I was the only writer who refused to get involved in any form of commemoration. I just thought it was too close to what was happening in the North, and that I didn't want any words of mine to get involved in sending out anyone or encouraging anyone to get involved in any further insurrection in Ireland for the foreseeable future. And so I left the country very deliberately that week and just stayed silent. But I didn't want to do that again. My grandfather had fought in the rebellion. And was destroyed by it in a lot of ways. I mean, a lot of people who fought in the rebellion became ministers or became, well, some people were shot, obviously, but others who survived. But some people just simply never got work again. When they went back to their towns, people just thought it was too strange. So anyway, as I was writing the last section of this book, I was also every evening sitting down with all of trying to piece together the story of how far back the 1916 rebellion went in the persona or in the person of Thomas Clarke, who was the oldest of those who, in other words, that he really had come out of the Fenian, of the dynamiting movement of 1867, and that in fact one of the best ways of understanding him is reading Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent or Henry James's The Princess Cassie-Massima, that he comes out of that period, served an incredibly long jail sentence, and then watching a figure like Patrick Pearse, who is close in his own way to Orestes, who begins as this dreamer, this poet, who's very interested in language revival. He wants to write poetry, and he wants Irish to be restored as the language of Ireland. And then you watch him over, say, a period of 4 or 5 years, moving from that position to going with Clark into full insurrection, that he will get a gun and he will take over a city without a mandate from anybody, and he will be shot, and his brother will be shot by the British. And so, yes, as I was working on one, the other was needed to also make progress. I mean, there was a deadline involved. And I also had written I'd written the libretto for an oratorio, which was performed in the National Concert Hall for tenor and baritone with an orchestra for Joseph Conrad and Roger Casement, who actually had known one another in the Congo and kept in touch in England afterwards. And so the figure of Casement was also there as that sort of, there was what Conrad said about him after his death to John Quinn was that he was pure emotion. And I was interested in that idea of what pure emotion does under pressure. The replies almost anything. And so, yes, the fact that this book was being written, the last sections, which are the most violent sections in a lot of ways, where the spiral of violence goes on, at the same time that I was preparing the piece for the London Review of Books, which was and the libretto. So yes, certainly Ireland is in the background here all the time. That idea that I come from a country that has had 2 civil wars in the last century, and if you call what happened in the north a civil war, which it was to some extent. Sorry, do you have?
Oh, no,
No?
sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry, I remember hearing quite a while ago that when you had a really bad idea, your instinct was to do the complete opposite, which I found really wonderful. And I was wondering if there were any terrible ideas, that you felt were terrible, that went by the wayside in the writing of this book.
What happened was that I had spent, I think, 13 years writing the novel Nora Webster, and I had done anything to stop writing it. I'd written The Testament of Mary in the middle, I'd written Brooklyn in the middle. I did anything not to finish that book. But once that book was finished, the problem was that I felt that I had nothing more, there was nothing more, nothing more to say, as much as that I had written that out of myself, the whole idea of Irish childhood, of Irish weather, of Irish family, of Irish manners, of Irish Catholicism, Irish rain. And I really didn't want it to end. I thought, once this ends, I'll just be, it'll be the end of me. And what will I do then? A few short stories if I'm lucky. And but oddly enough, the gods intervened, and really what happened was that at the time of the Testament of Mary, in order to try and explain what it was I had tried to do in that text, which was that I had used a lot of the Greek heroines, the idea that out of powerlessness comes power once you have a stage and a voice, and that the figure, for example, of Antigone is all power when she speaks, whereas Creon is all legislation when he speaks. So that she once she appears on the stage, by virtue of her speech, she has power. You cannot take your eyes off her when she's there. And so too with Medea, and so too with Electra. And so that I had tried to graft that idea on to the silences in the New Testament. And in order to do that, I had to read quite a lot. Just I would always have those books close to me, of Medea, Electra, and Antigone. And of course, I thought I knew the Electra story, but then I didn't, because I didn't know Iphigenia. It's a terrible title for a play, Iphigenia in Aulis. If you'd only called it something else, we all would have read it. And maybe in Greek it sounds wonderful. And once I saw that, it was absolutely clear to me, once I read that play, that this could now be done, and that also I could work with the figure of Orestes, and that I could build him, because he's absent, because there's a gap in that story, and it was the gap I was interested in. And part of the gap also was the gap where Clytemnestra does not get the same sort of speeches as Electra gets. So to give them to her gave me a certain pleasure, and to move Electra more into the shadows and let her mother get the big scene, get the sort of contralto or the coloratura scene.
Hi. Could you tell us a little about the title of the book, how it came about? I know I don't want to give anything away, but I know where it occurs in the book, and I know how it's used, the House of Names, but the names translates over into the palace and everywhere out through the book, but House of Names is used in a single context.
What happens is that Orestes has to be removed from the palace for the short time when his father is going to be murdered, and his mother gets Aegisthus, who's good at these things, just to, take Orestes away for the day while we murder Agamemnon. And Aegisthus realizes what he can now do, which is that he can have him kidnapped, which means we'll give Aegisthus a power over Clytemnestra. That Clytemnestra has been so crafty, so careful, and she's used Aegisthus so well, but she doesn't understand him. He will also do anything, and so that he has him kidnapped, and he has him brought to a place of, he goes through many experiences, but he has him brought to a place which is very, very like, I don't want to overdo this, but it's slightly like an Irish boarding school circa 1970 that someone who was in that school said to me, "Oh, I saw you put the school finally into the book." So you're around, all these boys are there, and there's all this sort of sense of fear. Anyway, he escapes with two other guys, and they cross the countryside, and they arrive finally at a place which is almost like something from a folk tale. And immediately I used an idea from the Tóibín, from Cuchulainn, which is that the woman has dogs, and they kill the dogs. And one of the dogs is killed precisely in the way that Cuchulainn in Irish mythology kills the dog. And the old woman says, "Well, I've no one to protect me now." And the three boys say, "Well, we'll protect you. We will stay with you," which is how Cuchulainn got his name, in fact, because he would be the dog, he would be the protector. And they stay with her. And she's also, in a way, out of Irish mythology, that she's almost a cailleach, the sort of the figure who seems to be slightly unearthly, witch-like, but also kind, protective. And it's almost that they move into a sort of hybrazil, into a Shangri-La, into a space where they almost forget where they're from, until, of course, the old woman dies and their friend dies. And the two boys are left there, and they realize they must go home. But one night, they always want to know what happened to the house. How come the woman is in this house that was obviously lived in by many other people? And some people, of course, were taken, all the men were taken for the war, which was the Trojan War. All the boats were taken. All the others fled, and they left her behind because she was too frail to travel. They left her with the dogs to guard her. And she just says, "Well, this was a house of names." And I'm using, again, back to an Irish source, Synge's Riders to the Sea. The idea when she chants the names of her sons at the end of that play, who've all been drowned, that her house, too, in Synge's play, Riders to the Sea, was a house of names. And so she talks about it as a house of names, but that she's also vaguely heard of Helen of Troy. That story has come in on the wind as a fragment, that there was a beautiful girl and people fought a war over her. And what's also come in on the wind is the story of the children of Lir, which is the story of the four children who are turned into swans. And for 900 years they roam the earth with a golden chain between them. And eventually they come back home after 900 years. When they land, their beaks and wings fall off, and they become very old people. and then they died. That story too of the swan has come in from Ireland on the wind into this sort of strange place, which was the House of Names.
I might ask you a quick question, Colm. It's not much of a question, but I was really struck by the phrase, the leftover language of prayer. I wonder if you might just talk about that for a minute.
Yes, I would like to talk about that. You know, when I was growing up in the small town, the southeast of Ireland, I was an altar boy, and I'm not making this up, but the bell of the cathedral, it was designed by Puget, and it was a beautiful building. It still is there, and that an altar boy would go at 20 minutes to 7 in the morning, and ring the 22 bell. The hour, it rang automatically on the hour. It was primed to do that. But on a Sunday morning, you ran 20 to 7 to wake up the whole town, and then at 20 to 8. And there was 7 o'clock Mass, 8 o'clock Mass, 9 o'clock Mass, 10 o'clock Mass, 11 o'clock Mass, and 12 o'clock Mass. And the church was full all the time for those Masses. Everyone coming up to communion, people bowed in prayer, a sense of absolute devotion. And there was also, on a Monday night, I think it was women's confraternity, Tuesday night men's, Wednesday must have been girls, and Thursday was boys. And they turned down the lights in the church. It was a neo-Gothic church. And a priest said, death comes soon. And we were all about 8 or 9. Death comes soon and judgment will follow. So now, dear children, examine your conscience and find out your sins. And we all sort of bowed our heads, wondering what it was we had done. And then, you know, at home you'd say the rosary, and often you just didn't listen to the words, and you got very used to the Hail Mary. But the Hail Holy Queen, you know, to thee do we send up our sighs, mourning and weeping in this valley of tears. It was really hard to have any fun, you know. I mean, it's just changing now that the pubs in Ireland close 2 days of the year, Christmas Day, because the whole family is meant to be together, and going out to the pub really would not be helpful to family life. But the other day was Good Friday. But when I was growing up, even if you went out to play on a Good Friday, someone would tell you to go in and contemplate the crucifixion. And those hours of the crucifixion, you would go over to the church and you would look at crucifix. I mean, it was really, you know, it was a full-on Catholicism. And so that began to go. That began to disappear. Now, the thing I've mentioned that thing I was reading there about the sounds coming. That would be an Irish thing, the banshee, the sound of, that certainly my mother and her sisters believed that when somebody in the family was going to die, that there would be a knock come on some unlikely door, you know, at some unlikely time, and there would be nobody there. And that would be the banshee coming to announce. But I actually asked them once, I said, but when did that stop? And they looked at me, what do you mean stop? I said, well, is it still happening? And they said, oh no. And it was as though some of the 60s put an end to many things. And that it belongs to a time when animism or paganism joined with Christianity. And that lasted in Ireland for about 1,500 years, where some sort of idea of pagan ritual merged with Christian ritual, which we can still see at something like Croagh Patrick, which is in the west of Ireland, County Mayo. The last Sunday of July, thousands and thousands of people walk up. It's a very difficult climb, and go to the top of it, go to the summit. But that was a pagan mountain. And then it became a Christian mountain. And it still remains a Christian mountain. I mean, it's not as though that has died. Some of the rituals remain. But I suppose what I'm saying is that I have lived in a time, in a country, which was so filled with, I mean, I hesitate to call things superstition, but there was a prayer we had. There was one prayer, which a nun had given my mother, and was a warning with it, to be very careful with this prayer, because you will get what you ask for, and be sure you want it. And you know, and I do know the opening. I mean, it's actually quite a common prayer I discovered later, but it wasn't said in the house, that prayer, because it was kept in a press, because it was considered so powerful that you would use it. But also there was an old nun who, she appears quite a lot in Nora Webster, who literally, because the nuns had their own chapel, she would go if she needed something and literally knock on the tabernacle. Literally knock, and she would come to our house and say, "Oh, don't worry, I knocked on the tabernacle," meaning that she'd ask God by knocking, as though God was in there asleep. He was like some sort of sleeping beauty, or some, or Brunhilde or somebody, or Siegfried. I meant Siegfried. But that all of that was in the air, and a lot of it has left the air. And so I was trying to sort of tease that out, trying to find some way of doing that without having to become a sociologist. Yes?
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Hi. I wanted to ask about a different novel, an enterprise, and that is The Master. If you could give us maybe a little Jamesian preface to what you meant to do, why, what was the compulsion in writing that?
I think what happens is fascinating, because Henry James dies in 1916 in London, and he leaves his estate to the family of his brother William, so that William's wife, who's also called Alice. Henry James had a sister called Alice and a sister-in-law called Alice. Alice braves the Atlantic. She promised William, when William was dying, that she would go to Harry. They always thought Harry was sort of helpless, as he sort of was, that she would go to Harry when he was dying and be with him. So she braves the Atlantic. She's a formidable woman, this Mrs. James. And the first thing she bans is any mention of Edith Wharton in the house. She has a loathing. She's heard something about her. I really don't know what it is. Maybe that she was divorced, or she was living in France, or she liked food, or whatever it was. Anyway, she banned even messages being sent to Edith Wharton to tell Edith Wharton how Henry James was. So she got rid of Theodora Bosanqueth because she had been James's typist amanuensis. She dismissed her immediately, and she took over the household. And when he died then, she immediately became concerned over what would happen now to his legacy, that she now and her sons owned. And they felt they made a mistake in allowing Percy Lubbock to publish the first volume of letters, because the letters shocked them, because there were letters to younger men written in a very effusive style, which even William Dean Howells thought was just strange. And she said to her sons, "Poor silly Uncle Harry." And so they realized that they'd just put a stop to the whole thing of anything to be known about him. And so, for example, when Heinrich Andersen, who had 70 letters from him, which are very important letters, wrote to them in 1930, that's 1930, to say, "I would like to publish these," they wrote back, "Absolutely out of the question, you will not publish them." Those letters did not appear until 2000. So they then, they brought in Leonie Dell to oversee the entire estate, to write the biographies, to edit the letters, and they oversaw him, even at times. I mean, they had all of the entitlement of the James family, with none of the talent, these two boys, Billy and Harry. In other words, they were so worried about what Harvard would think, or what Cambridge would think. And it is indeed true that Harvard and Cambridge in these years, as going into the 30s and 40s, might not have been too happy about the idea of this canonical American writer who may have been homosexual. It wouldn't have been a comfortable position to be his nephew if you were not an independent spirit, which they were certainly not. The next generation did the same. So it wasn't until the 1990s that the next generation realized that poor silly Uncle Harry, or grand Uncle Harry, was actually losing his cachet, that people were not reading him. People just thought him as a dead white male. And as you know, dead white males, nobody wants us. And so then a woman called Eve Sedgwick wrote this book called Epistemology of the Closet, which just outed him, just brought him right out there into the open. He was queer. He's here, he's queer, and he began to be put on courses again. People began to study him again. But also biographers became interested. Volumes of letters. There's a wonderful volume that's called Letters to Younger Men, the letters to Heinrich Andersen. Other biographers got involved. And the story of James seemed to thicken or become much more interesting in that last 5 years of the 20th century. And obviously, anyone like me who had nothing else to do, I just became fascinated by this. And but this whole, I had read all the novels, but now this character of Henry James seemed to be emerging into the light and filled with ambiguities. In other words, that, while he may have been homosexual, his best friends were women. He loved his family and got away from them as quickly as he could. He loved solitude, but went out every night. His grandfather was the second richest man in New York State, but James was always worried about money, even though he inherited quite a lot of money. He even owned things like a barber shop in Syracuse, and they owned a lot of Syracuse. The James Street in Syracuse is called after his grandfather. They're not called after William or Henry, because the grandfather was one of the investors in the Erie Canal and all that business. Anyway, suddenly he was there as a character. Instead of the self-suppression we feel in the novel, that James himself does not appear in the novels in the same way as George Eliot does, in the same way as James Joyce makes his way into the novels. That the elements of his life. Actually, setting Bloomsday on the very day that he walked out first with Nora Barnacle, that James would have been appalled at that idea of using the self in that way. But the self began to emerge as the same way as the self stayed in. And it was, again, that space in between the two things that began to interest me, and I thought I could work with.
So it came from that lacuna.
Yeah,
really.
it came from, also I was writing a novel, another novel set in Ireland with 6 characters and over 6 days, and it was very melancholy. It was called The Blackwater Lightship, and I just thought I'll never do that again. I don't want to hear another Irish person speak in my life. I really don't, and I'd had enough of all of them, with all of their prejudices and all the memories I was using and pulling things up out of myself. And I just thought, actually, it'd be lovely to just go to, do research in Venice and Rome and go to Boston and hang out with duchesses. Well, I didn't do that, but Henry James did that. And that I would have to write about, posh people instead of having to write about my own family. I should say my own family were vastly relieved when this book appeared.
Thank you very much for this. One reads that you like to write at a desk on a very hard bench, and that you initially write only on the right-hand side of the page. Can you tell us a little bit more about whether that's accurate and why, if it is?
I think it's crucial. There's a new thing in the architecture of the chair, which is made for the masters of the universe. It's one of those things where your back fits into. It's plastic, but it doesn't feel like plastic. It's sort of soft. And you can turn around. You're in the corner office, and you can turn around really quickly in that chair. It's almost like a wheelchair. It's such a strange object. But it's meant to be very good for your back. Well, I have no interest in that. That it's not a comfort zone. It's not a form of pleasure. I know what pleasure is. And writing is not pleasure. It's pulling things up. It's trying to find the next image. And so the harder the chair, the more likely the image is to be true. And the longhand is marvelous, just simply because it's tangible. You can touch it. You can touch the ink. Leaving the left-hand page blank is for arrow revision. So you can rewrite a paragraph, and just keep it there. So it's just a basic way of working, but it's it beats coal mining, but it's the whole point of it is that it's not as though you're involved in some sort of way of amusing yourself. You're not amusing. In other words, writing that ghost scene, I was, because you think if you're writing that about somebody might be coming looking for you. You can't just write. and make it up as you're going along. You know, what were these Greeks? What were they up to? You're writing that sequence where someone's mother is dead and is coming looking for him. And the more you work on it, the more it's you, and the more it's her, and the more it's the space you're in. And being in a comfortable chair at that moment would not help, because you're actually really need to get this right, because you mightn't ever get a chance again.
Thank you
Thank you very much. Thank you.